Yes, you can hear me? Yeah. All right. If only I could sing. I can't sing. All right. So anyway, I was saying that there's this software called Glue, and then you can go to this funky link, and you can watch me. What is Glue, and why are all those logos on the bottom of the screen? Let me just say that we are supported by NSF and NASA, and the two that you might not recognize is that's the Harvard Data Science Initiative. So I'm proud to be on the steering committee of the Harvard Data Science Initiative, and this one is the James Webb Space Telescope. And there's a story I can tell you at the end if somebody asks me as to where all the money for a lot of this project came from and what it has to do with the James Webb Space Telescope. So ask me at the end. Okay, what is Glue and why am I here? The Glue is a program that can glue together data sets, visualizations, and tools in real time and let you do exploratory data analysis on large and diverse data sets. And I'm just showing you a quick screenshot of somebody using Glue to explore the Orion Nebula. And you will not know, unless you're an astronomer, what any of this means. But by the end of the talk, you'll know a little bit more. But before I go on, I just want to explain that Glue itself is actually part of a much larger ecosystem that sometimes at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, where this started, we call seamless astronomy. And the whole idea is being able to put together lots of data sets and tools without thinking too much about how hard it might be to do that. And so the whole ecosystem up here, this comes from a paper that's about going back and forth from exploring and explaining your data. And the idea is that if you have tools that let you very, very rapidly explore your data, you can use the same tools, if they're good enough, to make explanatory displays of your data that wind up, in something dry that gets called a scholarly publication, or in something exciting like a YouTube video, and they can both come out of this system directly. And then what's really cool, you heard about Dataverse a few minutes ago, is that now there's a lot more of this data reuse. And programs like Glue also allow you to capture all of the data that you used, all of the code that you used, and all of the tools that you used in one little bundle and publish them right along with either your public outreach materials or your scholarly publication. And I'm going to show you an example of that at the end from a recent discovery that our group made about something called the Radcliffe wave. So you can stay in suspense, and I will show you the largest gaseous structure in the Milky Way at the end of the talk. Okay, but importantly, most of the tools, well, almost all of them, and what I'm going to show you, are open source, modular, repurposable tools, and the software development is done in the open, very collaborative. Okay, so from that to 1610, why am I showing you Galileo's moons? I said that this was a dream for many years to have software like this. In my world, a lot of astronomy is different from other sciences in that you can't go to your objects, other than, say, planetary science, okay? But, I studied a galaxy. I'm not going to live that long. I cannot go there and check out what's going on, and so we can only make observations. And observations in astronomy are intrinsically two-dimensional. You can see the sky, but the physics that you want to understand is three-dimensional or four-dimensional if you include time, or 11-dimensional if you're a particle physicist. But anyway, so Galileo did a lot of important work, including using a telescope for the first time to observe the sky. And the most important thing he did in terms of this two-dimensional and three-dimensional thinking was to appreciate that a little vision of dots around Jupiter were not other stars, but were in fact moons going around Jupiter in 3 dimensions. And what you see here is pages from his book, Sigurius Lynceus. And so over here on the side is the finished version. On the right-hand side is the finished printed version, which, by the way, if you try to reconstruct the moon's orbits from this printed version, because of the way typesetting works, this is not as accurate as this hand-drawn thing, or even as his original notes over here. But what this is a time series, and so this is the 7th, the 8th, 9th, the 11th, it was cloudy on the 10th, of January in 1610, and he's showing you a little dot for where's Jupiter, and then little asterisks for where what turns out to be the moons of Jupiter. And I'm going to show you a reconstruction of this, just a little tiny snippet from a program called Worldwide Telescope, which was originally made for outreach, but it has so much astronomy data built into it, views of the sky, links to databases, links to the entire corpus of astronomy literature online, Wikipedia, all kinds of things, that actually is now a very important research tool, and in fact part of this Glue environment that I'm going to show you. But let me just play a little video that has some sound, so let me just make sure it's loud enough. So this is a video recording of something that's actually an interactive online that, again, if we have time later, I can show you. Wait, let me make that louder. Whoops.
Galileo understood that if he could have observed Jupiter without interruption by daylight or poor weather, he would have seen this. Today we can see Galileo's correct picture from many perspectives, including a calculated view of Jupiter and its moons as seen from above.
So hopefully what you saw at the beginning was the moons just going back and forth on the sky, and then what he was trying to appreciate is that in actuality that is just a side-on view of moons going around, okay? So that's a really simple example, but that's what we have to do in astronomy all the time, is take a two-dimensional view and try to figure out what it looks like in 3 dimensions. But we have some major advantages. There, I have to touch the computer again, which are that we can observe the sky at many, many wavelengths. And we can use those different wavelengths and what we understand about the physics of what creates the different kinds of emission to kind of infer what's going on in a three-dimensional universe. And again, when we get to the Radcliffe wave, I'll give you an actual example of that. And so I was going to, hang on a second. Oh, I can't. Sorry. I'll give you a demo later. If I leave the online slides going, I can't also give you an online demo. Sorry. Anyway, trust me that in Worldwide Telescope you can see lots of data about the entire universe in 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions. And if we have time at the end, I'll show you. But now what you see here, again, is that screenshot of GLUE, and I can tell you now that this one image up here is actually the region that forms new stars in Orion, and the different colors are different kinds of emission. So while this is a very pretty picture, to me, those different colors mean a lot of things, and they actually mean stuff about emission from different molecules in space, and that emission is actually distributed in 3 dimensions, and this is actually a 3-dimensional interactive rotating plot when you really use it. And these are cuts in arbitrary dimensions, and what's going on here is that there's like 9 or 10 different data sets combined, but the point is how easy it is to do all this. And so I'll show you later what I mean. But first I have to explain why you would want to do this and where did it come from. So if you've heard the words exploratory data analysis together in a string like that, raise your hand. Excellent. If John Tukey is your hero, raise your hand. Favorite people. Okay. Well, John Tukey did invent the fast Fourier transform, but that was not the most important thing John Tukey did. The most important thing John Tukey did was write about exploratory data visualization, and what he had in mind was things like this. And so let's say that you had a 2-dimensional display of some kind, an image or a plot, and there was something particularly salient that you put this red square around, but actually this was inherently higher dimensional data, and you'd really like to see that same region in the higher dimensional display and in some statistical display and some data abstraction of the same data sets. You'd like to see it all, and importantly, you'd like to have it highlight live. And so we all know how easy it is to highlight things with a mouse or to touch it on your screen, etc. John Tukey, when he first invented this, for fun, I just have to tell you, he was at SLAC in the 1970s when he did this, and the thing he's touching in that little picture, which by the way, there's a great video of, I'll put the slides online, it's linked to the video, has 27 buttons, and the buttons do things like rotate left, rotate right. Okay, there was no mouse. Okay, so actually, what I'm going to show you next is where the heritage of GLUE starts. And it starts with John Tukey's system, which was called Prim9, and it had this system with the buttons, and that's a link to the video, and that's 1973. And then this, DataDesk, I'm going to be really surprised, but how many people have ever used DataDesk? Right, like no one, okay? How many people had a Mac in 1980? How many people were alive in 1984 is a different question. Mac in 1984. Okay, I did. Good job, Kathy. Okay, so a Mac had what that no other computer had in 1984 other than a happy face on the screen? A mouse, right, okay? So the whole interaction technique that we're so familiar with of a kind of graphical interface did not exist until 1984, and so you couldn't really implement what John Tukey wanted until then. But unfortunately, the Mac was not widely adopted in the world of statisticians. Instead, there was lots of, well, I won't name the programs, but you know them. Anyway, but they didn't involve a mouse, okay? So DataDesk actually still exists today, and Paul Bellman, who was John Tukey's student, is still the head of DataDesk. But that inspired other people to make things that you may have heard of, XGOBI, GGOBI, Polaris was the paper that inspired Tableau. So now raise your hand if you know what Tableau is or if you've used Tableau, right? Everybody. Okay? So now all I have to do is say that glue is Tableau, except not as good for tabular data, but way, way, way better for images and three-dimensional volumes and arbitrary Python tools that you might want to plug in, okay? Which is interesting to data scientists, but usually not that interesting in the business intelligence world. Okay, so now I want to take a step back a decade and tell you again why seeing glue work now is my dream come true, okay? So this is something that we did like more than a decade ago now. We published this paper in Nature that had the first interactive 3D figure in Nature. So this is a figure that tells you about self-gravity and star formation. We don't care about that today. Okay, but importantly, if you click on part of the figure, you can move around and interact with the figure, and you can turn parts of it on and off, and you know, you can do all kinds of fun stuff with the lighting, and it's kind of a very basic 3D display tool right inside of the PDF. And so that was fun, but the problem was that down here, see this plot down here, this is one of these statistical abstractions that I was talking about, and actually these little billiard balls on here, they mark positions that correspond to the billiard balls in there, and the features in this so-called dendrogram actually describe what's going on in there. But the problem is that in that paper, those two things were not live linked to each other. So you couldn't, you know, click on the statistical graph and then see where you were. So we got close, you know, but we actually wanted a lot more interactivity and a lot more sort of scriptability where you could go back and forth between a kind of command line interface and then beautiful displays like that. So what we had in mind was a very general system where you think about what the nature of your data is, how many dimensions your data have, and then how many dimensions your display has. And when I say dimensions, I don't mean necessarily literal spatial dimensions. They can be, you know, columns in a table. Okay? But I'll just use astronomy examples here. So in astronomy, if you have a data cube that shows you emission of something as a function of position on the sky and wavelength, which turns out in astronomy because of the Doppler effect to be the velocity, but it doesn't matter. Okay? But the important thing is that if you make a 1D cut through that, that's called a spectrum or a spectral energy distribution, or if the other dimension was time, it would be a time series. Okay? But importantly, you can think of the data as this high-dimensional cube, and a 1D cut through it just makes kind of an XY plot useful, right? And then a 2D cut through it would give you like an image, okay, at a particular wavelength, say, or at a particular time, and that could be either a cut, or you're probably familiar with the idea of kind of integrating or summing over the entire cube. It could be that too. And then, if you have actual interest in the three-dimensional structure, like say the moons of Jupiter are actually going around Jupiter, then you have to think about 3D displays and some sort of volume rendering like what you just saw, or you can think about 2D movies where you sort of slide through the third dimension. And then it gets really hard when you have three-dimensional data as a function of time, and then you have to have, you know, 3D displays that move. But ideally, you want to go back to that John Tukey thing in your mind, and you want to have all of these kinds of displays linked to each other, preferably for lots of different kinds of data at once. And so here's just an old image from something we did a long time ago that's called the Complete Survey of Star-Forming Regions. And all that you care about today is that there's a long list of data. And we like to call this wide data instead of calling it big data, okay? So it's like diverse data, and it's really the combination. We all know that, right? That it's the combination of different data sets and different kinds of data that usually holds even more power than just more of the same kind of data, right? Everybody's nodding. Yes, we all know this, why don't we say this more often? Anyway, so, right, so this is lots of different kinds of data, and for right now, what you care mostly about is that these green contours are actually the sum of data that has a third dimension that's not displayed. So if I do this, you can see a kind of standard, well, not very standard, but simple way to display what's going on in the other dimension. So the sum of all that white fluff is the emission from a particular molecule in space, and it's shown as those green contours. But it's awfully hard to understand what that really looks like in 3 dimensions. And so you can do things, and we stole the software originally to do this from the medical imaging community, and so we still have many collaborations with the medical imaging community, but we had this project originally that was called Astronomical Medicine, And what we did was take things like that data that you saw a minute ago and render it in 3 dimensions. And then suddenly you can see that, oh, look at that, there's this big shell of gas, and the reason it looks like there's stuff at 2 different distances is because it's at 2 different distances, but oh, now I understand where it is. And there's no way that anybody could figure that out from the kind of slide through the data that you saw before. Okay, so now, fast forward to now, we can put all of the kinds of data that I just showed you a minute ago in one software environment, and this is the list of lots of different data sets. It doesn't really matter, okay? But what you see here is exactly what John Tukey had in mind, okay? All different kinds of plots, real-time interaction, and 3D data, 2D data, etc. Okay, and so that's what Glue does. And I'll show you a very quick video, which does have sound now, that gives you a 2-minute demo of how it actually works. The step you won't see here is gluing the data sets together, but I'll talk about that in just a second.
Glue is a program for data exploration and visualization that allows users to better understand the relationships that exist within and between data sets. The main interface of Glue provides different data viewers. In this example, the viewer on the left shows an astronomical image of a region where stars are currently forming, and the 2 viewers on the right show a scatter plot and histogram derived from a separate catalogue of stars in this region. The viewers support interactive selection of data subsets, and selections are automatically propagated to other data viewers. In this example, the selected stars are shown in red in all viewers. One of the main features of Glue is the ability to link together different data sets using linear or non-linear mapping functions. In this example, we have linked the image and catalog data to make it possible for the stars to be shown on top of the image. Three-dimensional data viewers are also available. In this example, we can see the 3D distribution of all earthquakes recorded around the world in the last 6 years. The points are colored by the depth of the location where the earthquake originated. The lighter colors show earthquakes that occur deeper in the crust. This viewer also supports highlighting of selections made in other viewers, as well as direct 3D selections. Glue is designed from the ground up to be a multidisciplinary tool and allows users, for example scientists, to develop plugins to support particular data formats or data viewers. This example shows a volume rendering visualization of medical data that consists of brain scans. We have used Glue to overplot 2 different data sets, and we can interactively explore this data in 3 dimensions. Finally, Glue is written in Python and makes it easy to interact with the data and subsets using a built-in IPython terminal. For example, we can define new subsets programmatically and have these be automatically highlighted in the interface.
And let me just add, because I know you're wondering, that video is a few years old, and I'm going to show you in the end something called Glupiter. And so, yes, by the way, yes, we are collaborating directly with Fernando Perez and Jupyter, and so we are allowed to call it Glupiter. And so we have Glue running in Jupyter notebooks and Jupyter labs, or on the desktop. And so just for those of you who are interested in kind of the architecture of the whole thing, again, I said that there were 3 meanings of Glue, and so one is to glue data sets together, like you see here. I'll show you an example in just a minute. One is to glue the plots together, like you just saw in the video, and one is to glue tools together, like Worldwide Telescope that I just mentioned before, which is like a plug-in to Glue, but so can be gene browsers, medical imaging things, etc. And they don't have to run in Python originally; it's just easier if they run. By the way, we're very interested in building an R plug-in to Glue, so if somebody wants to do that, please let me know. And actually, we have money from the NSF to pay people to glue things like that, so definitely let me know. Okay, so when I say gluing data sets together, this is just a screenshot of what underlies what I showed you before when I showed you all these different plots open. And so there's a graphical user interface where you tell it for the different data sets you bring in what the shared attributes of those data sets are. And if they're not directly one-to-one matches, there's some pre-made, of where one is scaled by such that the pre-made relations in there, or you can type whatever relationship you want in Python to lay the data sets. This slide usually has a title that says why I have an FBI file, but I figured since I was in Boston, I should relabel it just closer to home. So this is actually a map of Logan Airport and the approach routes and taking off plan routes of of the planes from Logan Airport, and we have an antenna on the roof of the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics monitoring the three-dimensional positions of all airplanes over Boston. No, I'm sure I don't have an FBI file. Anyway, but why did we do this? Well, we did this to explain to people why we would want software like this without using this kind of astronomy data that I keep saying, oh, you don't have to care about that, or medical imaging data where you don't have to care about that. Everybody understands what planes do in 3 dimensions, although apparently not for the next 6 weeks. Anyway, and so one thing that you can see things immediately. I mean, everybody knows visualization. I hope everybody knows visualization is the best way to see what's going on in your data really fast. Okay, but one thing that we found that was really fun that you can see in this image, if you can see from the back of the room, is all the paths that are colored light blue. Those are the ones that you can see here are rising. So this is positive vertical rate, and this is negative vertical rate. And you notice that the dark paths here are all straight. Those are the planes that are landing. The planes are taking off are all curved. Did you ever notice when you're on a plane that you always land straight and you always turn right after you get? Where did you take off? I never noticed. I'm like, yeah, of course. Right, but you can see it right there in the data. So anyway, you can use this for all kinds of practical things. And so, here I promised to show you, yes, there is such a thing as Jupyter. Here's glue running in Jupyter Lab. I was in New York last week with Saul Shannabrook, who's the main developer for Jupyter Lab, and they're actually going to reconfigure Jupyter Lab to make it a little bit better for glue. So that's very exciting. And I mentioned the James Webb Space Telescope, and that they were very generous in supporting all this. And a lot of the reason that this is happening has to do with that. So again, you can ask me at the end. But I promised to give one fun astronomy example of something that we learned from glue. I'm not going to ask you who's heard of the Radcliffe Wave, because it's had a lot of press coverage, and we were very happy about it, but I'm sure you didn't see it. So never mind. Okay. So we had this paper in Nature a couple months ago, and yours truly got to be have the fun of giving the press conference at the American Astronomical Society meeting, which was a terrible hardship. It was in Honolulu, Hawaii. And so this is just some excerpts from the 7 minutes of press conference slides that I had. Okay, so this is something called the Radcliffe Wave that you're going to hear about. This is a cartoon model of the galaxy, our galaxy, which we live in, so it makes it very hard to make an image of it because we can't get outside of it, and we're in the disk of the galaxy. So this is sort of a data-motivated cartoon. Okay? And then what I'm going to show you is what we found. You're going to see some red dots appear on the screen very soon. And they're marking the positions of clouds of gas and dust that form new stars in the galaxy. And it turns out that we would have thought these were just kind of randomly sprinkled around the sun, but instead they're in this bizarre, damped sine wave shape that turns out to be the local arm of the galaxy. So you see these long patches, that was sort of where the arms of the galaxy were imagined to be. Well, it turns out that's actually there, and this huge collection of gas turns out to be right next to the sun, and we had no idea. Okay, we knew that there was gas, but we had no idea that it was distributed like that. And so why not? The why not is actually a data science story, so that's why I'm telling you this story. So anyway, it's 9,000 light years long. It's really huge. I'm sorry, that's not the point for today. The point is, how did we find it? Okay? So, let me answer that question, but my pointer seems to have stopped working, so hang on 1 second. Okay. All right. So the first thing I have to tell you is, for any actual astronomy aficionados or skeptics in the audience, I'm going to tell you about a really strange data science method of measuring three-dimensional distances using two-dimensional data. And so just to show you this, this thing here on the y-axis that says measure distances is the most accurate way to measure distances using something called parallax in our galaxy, known before we did all this. And nobody in astronomy, just please trust me, no one in astronomy would doubt these distances, okay? These are distance measurements using this new technique I'm going to show you that match sort of one-to-one. And these are distances to actual clouds in interstellar space, those little red dots that you saw in the previous video. So here's what happened. What happened is, there was a lot of uncertainty in measuring distances to arbitrary clouds. Those maser distances that I showed you, the really good ones, can only be measured at very special places in the sky where masers occur. Masers are the natural microwave equivalent of lasers that can actually happen in space. But they only happen in special places, and so you can't just measure distances to any particular thing. But with this other technique, you can. But anyway, so the distances that we had for non-maser regions to sort of the local collection of star-forming regions were really bad. Okay, so that was sort of where we thought they were, but the uncertainties in the distances were really large, and those uncertainties, you'll see that those error bars all point back to the sun, because remember, we're measuring a distance along the line of sight from the sun. Okay? So they were really bad, and then with this magic technique that I'll show you in the next 2 minutes, they got really small, and suddenly you can see something that you couldn't see before. Okay? So you can see that there was this huge wave-shaped thing. And so the way that this worked was this new technique, which is called 3D dust mapping, a new satellite spacecraft called Gaia that's measuring the three-dimensional positions of 1 billion stars. Okay, but this is not about the positions of the stars, it's about positions of gas. I'll show you in a minute. The software called GLUE and the software called Worldwide Telescope. Okay, so in one slide, how does this amazing data science technique for measuring distances to gas in interstellar space work? Well, let's say that this parallelogram here is your imaging plane. Okay, so you're going to take an image of the sky with this highly sophisticated telescope down here. Okay, and you notice you have one star out here in our very simplified version of space, and it's green. But I'm going to put some dust in the way, some dusty cloud, some sort of smoke out there in space, which is what we're interested in measuring, because that's the gas and smoke in space that form new stars like the sun. So we want to know where it is. Okay? And so if you let the light from that star pass through that dusty stuff, it actually changes the color of the light, the way that the sunset changes, the way that the clouds in the sky change the color of the sun at sunset. It reddens the light. Okay? And so we understand enough about the physics of how this works to know, if you know the color of the star and then you see it a different color, how much of this stuff was there along the line of sight. So then, if you have lots of stars, and in this cartoon we pretend that they're all the same color, in reality they're all different colors, but we know what colors they are, so don't worry about it, okay, intrinsically. But if they were all the same color, and then you pass them through some three-dimensional distribution of dust, and you see their colors in this 2D plane, and you have a lot of very smart people, graduate students, algorithms, and computer time, like 10 years worth, then you can figure out what three-dimensional distribution of stuff that changes the color is consistent with what three-dimensional distribution of stars. And that's very hard. And that leads you to the uncertainties that are kind of like the big error bars that I showed you in that red plot where the bars got smaller. So then you can cheat, okay? So you can infer the distance just from the dust effect on stars, but if you cheat, and you add in a satellite that tells you the distances to the stars really accurately, then you only have to infer the distances to the gas. And so the problem becomes half as difficult, and the uncertainties go way, way, way down. Okay? And so this is just a quick animation of what you can deduce about the distribution of dust in general near the sun. The sun would be at the center of that picture, and that brown stuff is dust and gas in interstellar space. And then you can visualize data like that, along with lots of other different kinds of data to figure out how this stuff is moving and where it is and how big it is and all this in GLUE. And right here, what you see is actually a plugged-in version of Worldwide Telescope. So this same program that I mentioned before is now just inserted as a plug-in tool into this GLUE environment. And the way you think of it is, if you ever see one of these snap circuits set, it's almost that easy. If you have a tool with an API and it's in Python, just snap it in. And the selections that you make across the various plots work, including in the plugged-in tool. And just for fun, here's Worldwide Telescope in GLUE again, and this is a good way to explain why we didn't find this humongous structure in space sooner, because if you only look at it in 2D, and you're not Galileo, it's very hard to figure out what this really looks like in 3D, and so you need that high-dimensional capability to go back and forth, that GLUE. Okay, so why didn't we do this sooner? Maser VLBI, the measurement of distances that I showed you that are really accurate, it's been around for 20 years, but we needed all this other software and Gaia to work in order to be able to do this. And so the last thing I just want to show you is that this is the figure from the paper, But importantly, we're still obsessed with interactive figures, and so, oops, hang on. So, oh right, I forgot, I can't do online demos. I'll show you at the end that that is an interactive figure. And you don't care about astronomy, so, okay, maybe you do, but I'm just going to skip that. And, oops, sorry. And so that's just to let you know that not only is the GLUE software available, but we recently have started to have so many requests from other fields that aren't astronomy or even medical imaging for people to use GLUE, and we just have a small research group and our collaborators at Space Telescope that we can't handle that kind of large-scale collaboration, so we have actually spun off a for-profit company that gives half of its profits back to other open source projects, and that's called GLUE Solutions Incorporated. So if anybody's interested in using this software in a corporate setting or in a non-astronomy, non-medical setting, let me know. And now we also have a blog about visualization, but I'm going to exit so that I can actually do anything online. So I just want to show you that now, if I play this not online, so hang on one second, non-online version, and I go back to that figure because that's the one thing I promised that I really have to show you. Okay, so GLUE itself can export to web environments in one click, actually. And so this is Plotly, and so this is the Radcliffe Wave in Plotly, which is the interactive version of the figure that you saw in the paper. And again, just like what you saw in 2009, people who are interested in particular things can turn on and off aspects of what's discussed in the paper, like what's the model fit, that's a damped sine wave fit to the data, and they can interact with the data, and you can hover over and find out what every cloud is if you know about that. And so this is really, in my mind anyway, fulfilling a lot of what John Tukey had in mind. And it makes me very happy, and I'm very happy to have been here. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll take some questions.
Yes.
I have a question about the stars color that you were mentioning.
Yes.
Since we can't physically go and check out the color of stars.
How do we know what color it's supposed to be?
Exactly.
Yes. I knew somebody really clever was going to ask that. So we know a lot about stellar structure and stellar evolution, and from the spectral colors of stars. So from measuring the color distribution that we see, we know what the intrinsic color of the star had to have been, even though it's reddened, because the relative amounts of color at different wavelengths are different for different kinds of stars. And so for a particular kind of star, which, by the way, is what those women in the very first picture that you saw this morning was studying, those Harvard computers. They were measuring the spectra of stars and trying to determine what their colors mean. And stars have spectral types that are ordered O, B, A, G, F, K, etc., not alphabetical now, okay? And that's because originally there was a classification system that went A, B, C, D, etc., before they understood that an O star was the most massive and a B star was less massive, etc. And it was those women and their work that actually resorted that alphabet and let us understand the answer to your question about what's the mass of stars, what color. A non-astronomy question.
It's kind of an astronomy question. What are the James Webb plans for
Okay. No, that's actually, turns out. Cool. Okay, wait. Hello? Okay. So there's a great story. Actually, there are two great stories about the funding of GLUE, which both of them I can't believe are true. So I had written a paper in 2012 that talked about the proto version of this when it wasn't real, but we sort of outlined why it would be a good idea. And I was visiting the Space Telescope Science Institute for another reason that had to do with Worldwide Telescope, and the person who was the director at the time, whose name is Matt Mountain, asked if he could see me, and I thought, well, I barely know him, but okay, sure. So I go talk to him, and he hands me this draft of this paper that isn't even published, and he says, if I gave you $1 million, could you make this real? Oh, okay, maybe, sure. Anyway, so that was like time one that this happened. So basically the James Webb Space Telescope said, we need this for what's called IFUs, So it's integrated field units, which take 3D spectral data is all that you need to know for you know that, but other people here don't know that. Anyway, for the next, James Webb is the successor to Hubble, in case you don't know what that is. So thank you for your billions of taxpayer dollars. And then the other thing that happened was they were so pleased with the work that had been done by my collaborators putting glue into the Jupiter environment that Arfin Smith, who some of you may know because he used to be the head of science at GitHub, he's now the lead data scientist for NASA, and he and his people there decided to use glue to underpin even more of the data architecture of not just James Webb, but Space Telescope Science Institute in general last spring. So there's a huge effort there. Oh, and the joke that I forgot to tell you was at lunch, we were walking back in May. He says, Alyssa, we have to have a funding conversation. And how many of you have ever heard, we have to have a funding conversation, and that turns out to be good news? And it's like, how much faster can you go? Because we really want to use this to underpin all. Anyway, so they have a lot of engineers there now. A lot, as in a handful, so in astronomy that's a lot, are working on the glue version of glue. So, oh wait, I forgot. I have gifts. Which, by the way, we're not allowed to pay with for grant money. We're not allowed to buy these, so you have to take them because I have stickers. And then importantly, I have the, oh yes, I heard ooh and ah, yes. It says, see clearly with glue. Anyway, any more questions? Something's back there. Yes?
So this is a more astronomy-based question.
Oh, astronomy. Anyway, yeah.
But now that we understand the red wave, what implications does that have over our understanding of how our solar system forms, like through the sun?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So the question was, now that we understand the Radcliffe wave, what does that mean about our own solar system? And you might think that they're on such different scales that the answer is it doesn't mean anything. But it turns out that's not true, okay? And you'll notice that this thing I skipped over says surf the Radcliffe wave, and at the time, oops, that was mostly a Hawaii joke. But the reason it says that is because actually the way that the orbits work in the galaxy, they're not completely circular, and they cross. And so the sun's orbit will have crossed the Radcliffe wave 13 million years ago, and it'll probably cross the place that the Radcliffe wave was 13 million years from now. And so there's actually interaction with the gas in the wave, and it could change the chemical composition of the planets that have formed in the solar system might have been affected, but not our solar system, but other solar systems that would form there. So that was a very bad answer. The answer, it's really, I'm sorry, I'm very tired, I'm very distracted by the fact that I can't go visit my daughter. But anyway, so basically the chemical composition of different molecular clouds, these star-forming clouds in different parts of the galaxy varies. And so if you have things that are formed in different places and then move to another place, you could find the traces of the chemical composition of where they formed. And so the stars that are forming in those clouds now will wind up in a different part of the galaxy. And we could potentially, there's something called Galactic Archaeology, where people actually try to trace the chemical composition of stars back to where they could have formed. You look very excited about that, yes? It's a huge data science challenge for those of you who want to switch into astronomy. Yeah.
I have a non-astronomy question.
Yes.
So can you tell us some non-astronomy use case?
Absolutely. So you saw, well, there was the airplanes, which turns out to not be a joke. So we did the airplane thing just to explain why people would want to see data in 3 dimensions and 2 dimensions and be able to analyze, flight paths of planes and the statistics of delays and passenger loads and all this. But it turns out that really the power of glue is also being able to look at 3D volumetric data. And so it turns out that the FAA is just getting to the point where they can have 3D radar data of sort of clouds and cloud density and wind. And it's not very high resolution data because it's really for just like big blocks of different altitudes, but it's 3D-ish. And so we're actually thinking about proposing to the FAA a system that would be based on GLUE, where pilots and ground traffic controllers would see the weather predicted to be ahead of that plane on kind of, shortish timescales where you could be sure that it was correct. And they could adjust flight routes, and pilots could request adjusted flight routes, based on what's in front of them. And of course, there could also be algorithmic ways to do that. And the cool thing about GLUE is that because it has this Python interface where you can go back and forth, is you could run some optimization algorithm and then see what that looks like and realize, kind of like that story we heard before about the game where there were all the zeros, and you don't want to do something like that. And so you really do want to see what you're going to tell the planes to do before you just issue some algorithmic command. So that's one example. And then another kind of really obvious example is in medical imaging. And so a lot of what I showed you was combining different volumetric data sets and images in astronomy, but imagine doing that in medical imaging. And one of the things, by the way, if anybody's interested in selections, making algorithmically driven selections in images or volumes, please come talk to me, because one of the things that we're trying to solve is what we call smart selection tools. And so in 2D, it's a little bit easier. You have lots and lots of radiology scans, and then you want to train an algorithm to find a particular kind of tumor in the imaging based on what's been done before. That's not too hard because there's a lot of segmentation like that. And then what you want to do is adjust the machine guess by hand in GLUE, because you want to see it and then adjust it. It turns out 3D selection is an unsolved problem. Okay, so you could do the algorithmic selection, but then adjusting it. And so by selection, I mean like using your hands. So if you had a HoloLens headset, or if you had Google Cardboard where you could see your real hands, but then you could also see the data projected in 3D. So imagine there's some brain scan here, and there's some tumor, and there's some segmentation algorithm that's been run, but it's not quite right, and I'm the radiologist or the surgeon, and I want to kind of adjust it with my hands. That really should be possible right now, but there is not the software environment to actually do that. And so we want to do that. So if somebody wants to do that, let me know. Maybe James Webb Space Telescope will somehow need it and pay for it.
All right, thanch you so much. Wow, what a great presentation. Very great visualization as well.